They stimulate more and more at those cycles, and so the debt levels and build up. We are in a situation where the power to do each other harm has advanced enormously, like great technologies. So the great technologies of doing each other harm are greater than ever before. So there must not be that. So that fear of that, we all should be fearful, everyone in the world.
In today's video, Ray Dalio, the founder of the world's biggest hedge fund, Bridgewater Associates, talks about the financial system and its working, money and the Fed. Dalio explains how he sees the world right now and elaborates on the macroeconomic picture. Before listening to him, please ensure to smash the like button and subscribe to the channel.
There's a short term that usually is what they call a business cycle. On average, it's averaged about 7 years. In other words, from recession to growth to bubble to recession, about on average 7 years, give or take about 3 years. And those have added up over a period of time to a long-term debt cycle because debt levels have risen relative to income levels. And the way it works mechanically is very cyclical because when you give credit, you give buying power. But credit comes with debt, and debt is the necessity to pay back. And therefore, when you pay back, that is not stimulative, that is depressing. And so it produces that cycle. And because central banks don't want the bad part of that, they stimulate more and more at those cycles. And so the debt levels and build up. And one man's debts are another man's assets. And so that balancing act continues. And that's the cycle. So in the world right now, mostly led by the United States, but other countries too, particularly Western countries, you're seeing the cycle, you're at the part of the cycle where there is the short-term cycle where there's a tightening of monetary policy. And that tightening of monetary policy to fight inflation, because, the cycle works, you put a lot of credit and stimulate and you create a lot of debt, and then it picks up the economy. And then with that, it produces inflation. The amounts that were created are unprecedented except in the 1930 to 45 period, the amounts of debt. So they produced an inflation. It should be not surprising. You produce a lot of credit, a lot of buying, it produces a lot of inflation. And so now you're seeing that tightness of monetary policy, but still you're producing more debt than you are paying back. In other words, the spending is greater than the incomes of the United States and a number of countries. And so that builds up. So we're in the tightening part of the short-term debt cycle. We're also at a stage in the cycle where the long-term debt cycle is a problem because there's a lot of paying back. You cannot sustain spending more than you're earning because then that reduces the returns and so on. So we are in a situation where even the United States dollar as the world's reserve currency is coming more into question, partially because the United States is no longer the dominant trading power. So, for example, China counts for a higher percentage of world trade than the United States does. And up until recently, it did not denominate that trade in Chinese currency, in renminbi. But increasingly, there is a desire both on the parts of those who are transacting internationally and in China to increasingly diversify their reserves and their transactions. And so you're seeing that happen. So that's very relevant. Now, that is happening at the same time, as you point out, as there's internal conflict. And that internal conflict is a wealth conflict. You know, there are big wealth gaps. Mm-hmm. And with those big wealth gaps, there are big values gaps. And those you're seeing cause great political gaps and greater extremism. So, in other words, is this resolved, this financial situation? Is this resolved through taxing the rich more or transferring wealth? And because taxing anybody is politically challenging, you see more printing of money. But it has an economic impact, and it also creates an anger internally. And so you're seeing that polarity. The conflict that we saw on January 6th, by way of example, or that which is going on with Brazil and exists in a number of countries, is that gap between the wealth and also the gap between the values of how a country should operate. Very classic, left and right. So we're seeing those things operate. So as we look ahead, we see a tightening of monetary policy having a depressing effect on markets. Markets are down significantly from their highs. Most markets are. And then you're seeing it have an effect on global economic activity, generally speaking. We could talk about China separately. It operates more independently. But if you take the world outside of China, that's the pattern. And so if you look at 2023, because of the tightness in monetary policy, will be a year of relative stagflation, relative stagnation. Depending on the world, you look at different parts. There's Europe, there's Japan, there's the United States, and then there's emerging countries, many emerging countries. And then we could talk about China if you like. Sure. It has its issues. So sure. And then 24 will be another political year, a very important political year. And populism is a win at all cost type of operation. So when you see, for example, recently, when you see a trouble of Republicans to find the House leadership, and you see extremists block and try to win at all costs, you see this degree of internal conflict. That affects the effectiveness of government, and it also will mean in 2024 there'll be a big conflict. So that's what it looks like to me. Almost destiny. When you follow these cycles, you see that when there are domestic problems, such as what we're talking about, and then the gap between world powers narrows, that there is no longer a matter of the conflict has a high probability of rising, because like in when this world order began, the American world order, in 1945, the United States accounted for half the world's economy. It had 80% of the world's money, which was gold at the time. It had a military dominance. And so, of course, there was not going to be the same kind of conflict. The conflict with the Soviet Union was not comparable because there was not comparable economic conflict. But now, when you have suffering at home, there's blame. There are sections, a lot of populism goes back to whether you lost your job and why did you lose your job? And it's a combination of the billionaires at home and the technology, and the Chinese outside is the perception. If there was not before, there was an appreciation to be able to buy things inexpensively from China and to be able to trade that for the debt. Wow. I remember when per capita income in China was 1/40th the United States, and China lent money to the United States to buy Chinese goods. And that was once a good deal, and now it's resentment. So you start to see the populism happen for that reason. But if there was not a comparability in power between the two countries, there still wouldn't be a fight. But with this comparability, the world doesn't have a world court. They don't have a way of resolving it. And so there's conflicts. And in history and now, there are 5 kinds of wars. There's a trade war, a technology war, a geopolitical influence war, a capital and economic war, and a military war. And we are certainly in the first 4 of those. And there are risks about the 5th. And so it's very difficult to get out of, because how are such disputes resolved? So there's a conflict that history has shown over and over to be the case. But you're right, to focus on domestic. At the end of the day, if you want to be the most powerful and win a war, be strong domestically. Be strong domestically. And that has to do with the basics. Earn more than you spend. Be productive. Educate your population well. Be civil. Don't have internal conflicts. And so both domestically and internationally, these basic fundamentals, earn more than you spend, be civil with each other, work well together, and all of those are what will determine the strength. So yes, there's a destiny to this. There's almost a very, very big pull, not just because of patterns, but the patterns happen because of reasons that now exist. What you do about it first, I think, is to recognize that you should be very fearful about a military conflict, each side, because the power to do each other harm has advanced enormously, like great technologies. So the great technologies of doing each other harm are greater than ever before. So there must not be that. So that fear of that, we all should be fearful. Everyone in the world should be fearful of that. Competitions are going to change. I think they'll intensify. Trade war, technology war, geopolitical influence war, economic and capital wars. I think that those will, and that'll be a test of the strength of the two systems. So I think that that's what we're looking forward to. So we must not have that military war.